In his new book, former FBI agent Peter Strzok delivers a warning about the troubling connection he and other agents saw between the president and our nation's adversary, Russia. Quote, given what we knew or had cause to suspect about Trump's compromising behavior in the weeks, months, and years leading up to the election, moreover, it also seemed conceivable, if unlikely, that Moscow had indeed pulled off the most stunning intelligence achievement in human history, secretly controlling the president of the United States, a Manchurian candidate, elected. Joining me now is Peter Strzok. He's a former counterintelligence agent with the FBI, a favorite target of President Trump, and author of the new book, Compromised: Counterintelligence and the Threat of Donald J. Trump. So, Peter, welcome. Thank you for coming on and joining us today. Congratulations on getting the book out. Let's talk about that feeling that you and other agents had. We heard something similar from Alexander Vindman in the past week, and also out of Bob Woodward's book, Dan Coates, apparently, according to Woodward, couldn't shake this idea that Russia had something on Donald Trump, that Vladimir Putin had something on Donald Trump. You also say that there's never been a real investigation into the president's finances. What do you think might come out of an investigation like that?
Well, thanks for having me. I think when you look from a counterintelligence perspective about what creates vulnerability, there are things in President Trump's background that he does not want known, whether it's his financial entanglements, whether it's actions he's taken in his past that he is actively and aggressively fighting from becoming known. Now, if you're a foreign intelligence service like the Russians have, which are really, really good, you can get to that information. And I think that not only have they gotten to it, but that they are using it in a way that is placing a coercive force over him such that he's not able to act in America's interests. And that's something that, again, as you mentioned, it's seen by all these people around him, whether it's Colonel Vindman, certainly the former director of national intelligence, Dan Coates, who is a Republican senator from Indiana for 16 years. These aren't partisan concerns. These are national security concerns. And it ought to be concerning to all of your viewers that person after person after person expresses the same concern about whether or not the president is able to act in America's national interests when it comes to Russia.
Well, you've done these kinds of investigations before. What kind of financial ties would lead to the president being even an unwitting puppet of a foreign leader? What sort of things would you be able to discover, in theory, if this investigation happened?
Well, certainly anything that's hidden, anything that President Trump does not want coming out is going to present potential leverage. As an example, I mean, there are many things that haven't been said or I can't speak about, but one of the things that's come out through the Mueller report is the speech, for instance, that then candidate Trump in 2016 gave, where he stated unequivocally that he had no Russian financial interests whatsoever and no financial dealings. The moment he's saying that, at the same time, Michael Cohen is busy working with folks in Moscow and within Russia trying to get a deal for a Trump Tower in Moscow, where they'd give Vladimir Putin the entire top floor. Now, the moment Trump says that, he knows he's not telling the truth. Vladimir Putin knows he's not telling the truth. And so if they're going to keep that lie a secret, something that would really harm Trump if the truth were to come out, Trump is all of a sudden beholden to Putin and others to keep that secret. Now expand that to all the financial entanglements that you see him fighting tooth and nail to prevent coming public. All of those things represent individual items that can be used as leverage over him.
Let's talk about trust in the FBI and law enforcement. Obviously, we know you sent those disparaging texts about Donald Trump and his supporters back in 2016, and you've said that those are your own private opinions. Everybody is entitled to their own private opinions. But the fact is that those texts underestimated what, in your estimation, was a very serious investigation into the candidate Donald Trump, the president Donald Trump, and our national security. How does the FBI, how do law enforcement build back trust, and not just trust from one party, but trust from all Americans, or at least the majority of Americans going forward?
Look, so the first thing the FBI just needs to do is continue what they've always done, and that's objectively pursue the truth, to fearlessly follow the facts wherever they may lead. They did that the entire time I was in the FBI, and I'm certain that's continued to this day. What we need to look at is whether or not it's acceptable behavior for what this administration has done in attacking individual civil servants who have either spoken the truth or had private opinions that have gotten weaponized. You know, the Department of Justice illegally released my texts in the middle of the night to the media, telling them they couldn't even cite that they had come from DOJ. And that was weaponized in a way for partisan motives that is completely inappropriate. We need to look at what the boundaries are for what is acceptable behavior coming out of the administration, because the things you see them doing time and time again from people, whether it's in the Department of State or the Department of Defense or the FBI, this isn't just an FBI issue. This is an entire government issue, and it's behavior that isn't appropriate for the president to engage in. And we've got to get back to the ways of the past and respecting that professional civil service.
Let's talk quickly about the Durham investigation, which is the investigation into the origins of the Trump investigation, the Trump-Russia investigation in 2016. You've said that you have not been interviewed in the Durham investigation. Presumably, we're pretty far along into it, if not coming to a close. Are you concerned now that you haven't been interviewed and that you might be a target?
Well, I'm not worried about being a target. I didn't do anything wrong, let alone illegal, nor did I see anybody else that I worked with doing anything that was inappropriate. So I'm not worried about that. It is certainly concerning to me that me, and from what I've heard, others in the senior leadership haven't even been approached. And it's particularly concerning when I see last week his deputy, somebody that he worked with for decades over a variety of complex investigations, quitting because, if you believe the reporting, the concerns that the investigation had become politically tainted, that it was being rushed for inappropriate political motives. And so when I see that prosecutor joining the prosecutors on the Roger Stone prosecution who quit, when I see them joining the prosecutor on Mike Flynn's prosecution who quit, these are all people of conscience and integrity who can't stand by and participate in what they see as a politicization of the Department of Justice. So that gives me a lot of worry about what's going on behind the scenes at the Department of Justice and with Durham's work.
25 years from now, how does history see you?
I think it sees all of us as patriots who were working as hard as we could to defend America against a Russian threat, against a Russian attack on our elections that helped elect the 45th president of the United States.
Peter Strzok, thank you so much for joining us. The book is called Compromised. Thank you again, sir.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.